Where do we stand? When you look at all the variations of the sayings and the doings of Jesus, we do not have eyewitness accounts. We have names on our canonical and inspired Gospels, true, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but those names did not appear on those Gospels until late in the 2nd century. In fact, we don't know who wrote any of them, and we know that they weren't eyewitnesses. We know with whom the tradition came to associate these documents, but we do not know the actual historical authors. They're all anonymous. The author of Luke tells us that he was not an eyewitness. He tells us that he's in the 3rd generation. He's in stage 3 of gospel development, and that he's borrowed what he knows from a lot of different folks and put it all together into a story. Fact, we do not have a single eyewitness account of the earthly Jesus. Moreover, we don't have anything written by Jesus himself. Jesus was almost certainly illiterate. There are no schools in 1st century Syro-Palestine, folks. It may be shocking for modern Christians to learn that there were no schools in Nazareth, not one. Israel had the lowest percentage of literacy in the Roman Empire, possibly as low as 0.5%. We do have almost certainly legendary stories written by Jesus group people many years later about why Jesus could not read and write. Because remember, the people who are writing these stories and hearing about Jesus are people who are like, they're people who can read. Why should I hear about some bumpkin who can't read and you're telling me he's Messiah and cosmic Lord? Well, we got to now write another story making an excuse why he couldn't read and write. So we have one of these in the infancy Gospel of Thomas, chapter 14, verse 1 to 3. It's a real hoot. His teacher says to Jesus in Alexandria, "Okay, Jesus, what letter is this?" He's got alpha there, you know. "You're the teacher, you tell me." So he hits him, and then don't mess with little Jesus. These legendary accounts seem to be explaining away what was perceived to be an embarrassment to the elite of the Roman Empire. The fact that everybody knew Jesus couldn't read and write. But Jesus himself never wrote a book, did he? Yeah. We do not have a 21st century precise chronological account of his life. Mark created the first chronology of Jesus' life, one dry season long. Mark probably intended it as a sort of representation of the adult Jesus and what he did every year in his ministry during the dry season. But how many dry seasons or years did he actually do this? We can't be certain. In the 4th gospel we call John, it's 3 dry seasons, but it's so hit and miss and fails to correlate with Mark's account. So you quickly get the idea that these chronologies are also theological. They're not historical. These writers are inviting their readers and listeners into what they believe. They're not doing news reporting. So we do not have an exact or precise chronology of Jesus' life. Again, we don't have much historical information about his birth, do we? We have just one report of Jesus' childhood, and it comes from Luke. It's both interesting and puzzling. Recall the story. 12-year-old precocious Jesus is in the temple with his family. Family heads back to Nazareth, but the precocious youth stays behind, talking with the elders. Remember? Those of us who pray the rosary, right, we consider that a joyous mystery. But I guarantee you that in the original context, if Jesus had actually done it, it would have been the 6th sorrowful mystery for Jesus. Because when Joseph, the Middle Eastern male, got a hold of him, of the post-pubescent Jesus, he would have learned him a few. If you understand about Middle Eastern child rearing of males. Anyway, So I want you to recall that Luke was educated and lived in a Greco-Roman city as an elite. If you investigate those ancient schools in such cities and look into the textbooks called progymnasmata, of which they used to help students learn to read and write, and we know that Luke was trained this way, you're going to discover something very interesting. One of the schoolboy textbooks, the progymnasmata, tells us that whenever you write a story praising someone great and famous, you have to write at least one childhood incident. Namely, one provides an omen foreshadowing what the child will eventually become. And Luke does exactly that. He has him in the temple having an exchange with religious leaders, doesn't he? That foreshadows. Did that actually happen? Luke, who clearly has a very, very high Greco-Roman education, would have learned from these textbooks how to write a story. And was he writing for Americans, folks? If he wasn't writing for Americans, don't be shocked, Americans, that he's writing for Mediterraneans. He's writing for people who have different interests than fact-precise biographies. So, is the Lucan episode of the young Jesus being found in the temple an historical event? Almost certainly not. Does it tell you who Luke believes Jesus is? Absolutely. It's true, even if it never happened. And that is the only incident you have recorded about the childhood of Jesus anywhere from the 4 canonical Gospels. Many early Jesus group people did not like that. They wanted more. Give us some more info about the early times of Jesus. So they created other infancy gospels. For example, the infancy gospel of Thomas and the apocryphon of James. That means something like the secret book of James, or the secret gospel of James, or the secret book of James. It's a book with a bunch of stories in it that got cooked up many years after. And these are full of stories about the young Jesus and his adventures. These definitely would not appeal to us modern Western people. In one, Jesus the youth crushes a bird in his hand and kills it, and then he laughs. And then he lets it go, comes back to life. It's a little bizarre. And one of his playmates insults him, so Jesus kills him right before bringing him back to life. So you got Joseph here. Jesus, you push Zeno out the window? No, Joseph. He doesn't call him dad. In one part of this text, he says Joseph to him, and Joseph, don't call me that. Hits him. Hey, don't hit me again. You're not my father. He says to him. Don't Joseph me. Haven't you got us into enough trouble here in Egypt? But I didn't. Ask Zeno. And he raises Zeno up. That's what happens in the secret BS of James. It's bizarre stuff. But it filled the need for early Jesus group people who sat around wondering, well, I wonder what Jesus was like as a kid. And they just kept augmenting, and Paul Bunyan syndrome, you know. So we do not have an eyewitness account. We do not have an exact chronology of Jesus' life. We don't have much historical information about his birth. We do not have a theologically pure account of his childhood, upbringing, or education. We do not have an account of his early adulthood, his work career, or ordinary daily life. We do not have any information about who might have influenced him before his public career. There is an early Jesus group writing that tells that Jesus' family made the yokes of oxen in Nazareth. In our Gospels, Jesus is called a tekton. We translate that as carpenter, but it means something like village artisan, a day laborer. He could have been a metal worker, he could have been a stonemason, maybe perhaps occasionally he worked with wood. Could have done all of this. It's possible the historical Jesus and his family did make yokes for oxen. What lends plausibility to this story is that these ancient yokes didn't wear out too easily. If your work is limited to tiny Nazareth with no more than 200 people, making yokes for the oxen there, you're going to starve to death. So that means that you probably have to do a lot of traveling to and from Nazareth, going to nearby villages to work, like Sepphoris, maybe Capernaum. In antiquity, anybody who traveled like this was considered a social deviant. Which is, by the way, exactly the reaction Jesus received, wasn't it? From everywhere he went. Yes, Begonia.
Sorry, why would that be deviant to travel from those to those?
Oh, because you're only in your in-group. Your in-group is your first, second, and third cousins all live patrilocally in your village. Why would you be going out of there? I don't know who you are. You're an outsider. But necessity demands I need your skills. Watch out for the evil eye. So, did the historical Jesus make yokes for oxen? It's plausible. We can't be sure. We can't make a judgment whether this is historical or not. But maybe that was his occupational specialty. We do have minor hints about his religious practices, or lack thereof, and his knowledge of Israelite religion. Jesus probably was illiterate by our standards, but it's also very possible he had memorized the whole Torah and the book of Isaiah, could repeat it to you back from memory. And if you think that that's implausible, I'd suggest go to the Middle East and see peasants there. They have the Quran memorized frontward and backward that are totally illiterate. The names of some of the people who followed him and interacted with him, many of whom were clearly historical personages. We do have knowledge of his death at Jerusalem. It's even referred to by two Roman writers, Tacitus and Suetonius. We do have many isolated sayings, anecdotes, and events, some of which are undoubtedly historical, some of which are not. The problem of the historical Jesus. The Gospels are interpretive and theological accounts, not 21st century Western biographies or history books. The fact is that the Jesus of no two Gospels is completely alike. Even in the Synoptics, there is tremendous different interpretations of Jesus to be found. As we've seen in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is the new Moses. That's not even on the radar screen of Luke and his understanding of Jesus. Historical data is minimal and very rarely on the surface. Some of the stories are undoubtedly historical. Others are borrowed, created, embellished, and theologized. The problem is, how do we tell which is which? The bottom line, one cannot simply read the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and expect to uncover an account of the historical Jesus. Question: how many Big C Catholics do you know that assume that they can just pick up the Gospels, read them, and get a straight up history of what happened to Jesus? Show of hands. Very few of you know them? How many of you know Christians, and maybe some of you in here were one of them, that knows people in your church community that they think that if they just pick up the Gospels and read, they've got the history of Jesus? Okay, we got hands going up and down. All right, forget it. That didn't work. Since the Enlightenment, we have come to be so literalistic in our way of thinking about reality that we tend to only trust what is factual and tend to say that something isn't true if it didn't happen. But many things are true that didn't happen. It really is true that Jesus was a new Moses, even if he never went down to Egypt land like the story goes. We are so literalistic in our mentality that we automatically make the assumption that the biblical authors were writing 21st century fact-only histories of the life of Jesus. They weren't. These Gospels are confessions of faith, works of theologies, plural. They speak of the meaning of Jesus and why it matters and what about it matters in your life. Not exactly what happened when it happened. When you try and reduce the Gospels to collections of precise facts in 21st century Western biographies, we create the morass we have looked at so far today. The reason you have trouble, how many people here are troubled by what I've presented and feel troubled inside? Okay, good. That shows you're a 21st century Western person. Yes, Robert.
Bill, all of this is of course true, and this is very clearly a modern predisposition or a modern bias, but it's not to say that even in the ancient world, we didn't see a tendency towards harmonizing. For example, we had Tatian's work.
The Diatessaron.
The Diatessaron, right? That tried to basically take these disparate historical events.
Sure.
And, you know.
And that, of course, comes from an elite later on who's dealing with elites saying, well, this and that and the other thing. They're more quasi-rationalistic, not rationalistic yet. We have to talk about that, and we will get to that. Bridget, that's an excellent point, brother. Bridget.
So I was...
And by the way, the church condemned the Diatessaron.
Right.
And celebrates the fourfold testimony with all the discrepancies. Yes, Bridget.
I formerly got into a conversation with someone that's atheist and said to me, well, you can't possibly believe that an angel came to Mary and basically out of the Holy Spirit a child was born. You can't possibly believe that. That's methodological and theological. And so I said, well, I do believe it because I have faith that there is miracles that happen. And so she started saying other facts of the Bible that are not true. Yet I didn't have the knowledge I have now, so how, did that happen, first of all?
Okay, so there's two things there that I'm looking at, right? So you have the idea that the Lucan infancy narrative can be highly augmented, contrived, and even invented, part of it, in how the things that it describes speaks of, like the Annunciation to Mary. You know what's not contrived? That 80% of the world's populations and cultures regularly and routinely experience other than human persons in trance states, except the Baltic personality of the Western world. So if you're going to deny, because that's impossible to happen, and by the way, notice the Western reaction. Right. It's a miracle, meaning it's a violation of the laws of physics that happen, not for 80% of the world. There's no laws being violated when an other than human person speaks to us in an altered state of consciousness. No, only for us Westerners. Because for us Westerners, according to Arthur Kleinman, cultural psychologist, we are the culture that needs to be explained. We're the one that blocks those experiences. So the details of Luke chapter 1 and 2 are not all historical. Yes, that's right. The reported fact that a other than human person, Gabriel, spoke to the human person, Mary, is completely plausible among 80% of the world's cultures.
And 100% of the ancients.
And 100% of the ancients. Thank you, Robert. So you have to look at it even in a deeper way.
Jesus was then conceived without the sin.
Without a human, Jesus was conceived. Okay, that's another thing. We often confuse the Immaculate Conception, because we have such a piss-poor view of sex. We confuse the Immaculate Conception, well, this one aggravates me, with the Virginal Conception. You're referring to the Virginal Conception. Okay, so the Virginal Conception, we believe that as Christians. We'd have to explore that, and I invite you to go on the Mary study that I have on there, and that goes into, it's a long thing, but 67 videos and more, actually. But you go into that on YouTube playlist, and it'll take it step by step through the understanding of virgin. Both Matthew and Luke not only say Mary was a virgin in the ancient sense of what that word meant, they also affirm she was untouched by man. All right, and so we have to look into that. That got on an interesting track with Augustine 400 years later. Okay, Augustine wanted to biologize sin and protect the sinlessness of Christ, and so he went down the road with that. And we're still having an Augustinian headache. Anyway, I love St. Augustine, pray for us, but sometimes you say too much. Anyway, Here's the thing. When we try to reduce the Gospels to collections of precise facts in 21st century Western biographies, we create this problem. We create that situation why we're very, as Western people, ill-equipped to deal with. Hey, thanks for watching. Just continue the playlist for the next part of the study. If you have further questions, this is good. They will get addressed, so keep watching. If you found value, please subscribe, like, and share. As always, questions, comments, and criticisms are most welcome. God bless you.